Forget what you've seen in the movies. The real Wild West was a whole lot messier. We're digging into the true stories of showdowns so intense they changed towns forever, like the time an entire gang tried to rob 2 banks at once and faced the fury of everyday citizens. What if I told you the most famous gunfight in history, the one at the OK Corral, wasn't even at the OK Corral? The real story is crazier than you could ever imagine. 1. Wild Bill Hickok versus Davis Tutt. Let's start our journey in the summer of 1865 in the dusty town of Springfield, Missouri. This is where one of the first true quick-draw duels happened, the kind you see in all the cowboy movies. The 2 main men in this story were James Butler Hickok, better known as Wild Bill, and a gambler named Davis Tutt. Believe it or not, these 2 used to be friends, but as it often happens, a falling out over money and a lady came between them. The trouble really started over a card game. Wild Bill and Tutt had a disagreement, and Tutt ended up taking something very important from Wild Bill, his prized pocket watch. Tutt said he would keep it until Wild Bill paid him what he owed. To make matters worse, Tutt declared he was going to wear the watch right in the middle of the town square the next day. For a man like Wild Bill, this was a huge insult. It was a challenge he could not ignore. The next day, just as he promised, Tutt walked into the square with the watch plain for all to see. Wild Bill saw him from a distance and warned him not to cross the square wearing it. Tutt just smiled and kept walking. With about 75 yards between them, both men reached for their pistols. The air filled with a loud crack as they both fired at almost the same time. Tutt missed completely. Wild Bill, however, was a legendary marksman. His shot was true, and Tutt fell to the ground, his time on Earth over. This showdown set the standard for many to come. A true one-on-one face-off. A single shot decided that fight. But what happens when the fight is not one-on-one, but a tangled mess of lawmen and cowboys where 4 men go down in the blink of an eye? 2. 4 gone in 5 seconds. Now let's travel to the town of El Paso, Texas, in the year 1881. This place was a rough and tumble frontier town, and on April 14th it became the scene of one of the fastest and most confusing gunfights in history. The whole thing was later called the 4 gone in 5 seconds gunfight. And let me tell you, that name is no exaggeration. The trouble began when a group of local workers needed protection while they were at a court hearing about a land dispute. A lawman named Gus Creamer, who was pronounced Creamer, hired a man named Dallas Stoudenmeyer, pronounced Stoudemire, to be the new town marshal. Stoudenmeyer had a reputation for being tough as nails. On the day of the hearing, a constable named Gus Kremkaw got into a heated argument with 2 of the workers, and things turned ugly fast. Suddenly, a former marshal named George Campbell stood up and yelled for everyone to stop fighting. Right at that moment, an innocent bystander was struck by a stray bullet and fell. Stoudenmeyer, the new marshal, saw Campbell with a pistol in his hand and thought he was the one who fired the shot. Without hesitating, Stoudenmeyer turned and fired. Campbell went down. Then Kremkaw, the constable, saw his friend Campbell fall and drew his own weapon. Stoudenmeyer spun around and put an end to his fight too. Finally, Stoudenmeyer saw John Hale, a friend of Campbell's, trying to get away. He took aim and Hale became the 4th man to fall. It was all over in less than 5 seconds, a whirlwind of smoke and confusion that left a town in shock. That chaotic brawl was between lawmen and their associates. But the most famous gunfight of all involved a group of brothers and their friends against a gang of cowboys, and it happened in a place you would never expect. 3. The gunfight at the OK Corral. You have probably heard of the gunfight at the OK Corral. It is the most legendary showdown of the Old West. But here is the first secret. It did not actually happen at the OK Corral. Truth be told, it took place in a narrow, empty lot right next to a photography studio. The year was 1881, and the town was Tombstone, Arizona, a place living up to its name. On one side, you had the Earp brothers, Virgil, Morgan, and the famous Wyatt Earp, along with their good friend, Doc Holliday. They were the law in town, or at least they were trying to be. On the other side were the Cowboys, a group of local ranchers and troublemakers led by Ike Clanton and the McClory brothers, Tom and Frank. For months, tension had been building between these two groups. There were threats, arguments, and a whole lot of bad blood. On the afternoon of October 26th, things finally boiled over. The Earps and Holiday decided to confront the cowboys and take their weapons, since it was against the law to carry them in town. They found the cowboys gathered in that empty lot. Virgil Earp told them to throw up their hands. What happened next is a matter of debate, but it ended in a storm of bullets. In about 30 seconds, over 30 shots were fired. When the smoke cleared, Tom and Frank McClory, along with another cowboy named Billy Clanton, were down for good. Virgil and Morgan Earp were seriously wounded, and Doc Holliday had been grazed by a bullet. Wyatt Earp was the only one left standing without a scratch. The fight itself was over in a flash, but the story was far from finished. This famous gunfight was just the beginning of a much longer and more personal war. 4. The Northfield Raid. It is one thing for a few men to face off in a dusty street. It is a whole other story when a notorious gang of outlaws tries to take on an entire town. That is exactly what happened in Northfield, Minnesota, on a September day in 1876. The outlaws were none other than the infamous James Younger Gang, led by the legendary Jesse James himself. The gang had a bold and reckless plan. They were going to rob the First National Bank of Northfield in broad daylight. They thought it would be easy. They would ride in, grab the money, and be gone before anyone knew what was happening. They were very, very wrong. A few of the gang members went inside the bank while others stood guard outside, trying to keep the townspeople away. But the citizens of Northfield were not easily scared. One brave townsperson saw what was happening and started shouting, "The bank is being robbed!" That was all it took. People opened their windows and came out of their shops, not with their hands up, but with their rifles and shotguns ready. They started firing at the outlaws in the street from all directions. Inside the bank, the heroic bank teller refused to open the safe, and he paid the ultimate price for his bravery. The gang, realizing their plan had gone terribly wrong, tried to escape. 2 of the gang members were taken down right there in the street. The rest of the gang barely managed to get away, but the chase was on. The people of Northfield had shown the whole country that they would not be pushed around. The James Younger Gang was nearly wiped out by a town that fought back. But years later, another group of outlaws would try a similar, even more ambitious plan, and they would meet an even more decisive end. 5. The Dalton Gang's last stand. If you thought robbing one bank at a time was bold, what about trying to rob 2 banks at the same time? That was the incredibly risky idea cooked up by the Dalton Gang. The year was 1892, and the place was Coffeyville, Kansas. The Daltons used to be lawmen, which is hard to believe, but they had turned to a life of crime, robbing trains and banks all over the territory. Their leader, Bob Dalton, wanted to do something that would make them more famous than even the James Younger Gang. His plan was to hit 2 banks in their old hometown of Coffeyville at the very same moment. He thought the surprise and confusion would let them get away clean with a huge amount of cash. On the morning of October 5th, the 5 members of the gang rode into town disguised with fake beards. But the people of Coffeyville were sharper than the Daltons gave them credit for. A local citizen recognized one of the gang members and quickly raised the alarm. Just like in Northfield, the townspeople did not hide. They grabbed their weapons from the local hardware stores and prepared to defend their town. As the Daltons tried to leave the banks with their bags of money, they walked out into a storm of gunfire. A massive battle erupted in the streets, lasting for about 15 minutes. When it was over, 4 of the 5 gang members, including Bob Dalton, were no longer a threat. 4 of the town's brave defenders also fell in the fight. The Dalton Gang was history, and the people of Coffeyville became heroes of the Old West. Fighting a whole town is one thing, but often the most intense fights happened in the one place everyone gathered, the local saloon, where a single wrong word could lead to chaos. 6. The Long Branch Saloon Gunfight. Let us head down to Dodge City, Kansas, the so-called Queen of the Cowtowns. This place was known for its rowdy cowboys, its bustling saloons, and its tough-as-nails lawmen. And in the heart of it all was the famous Long Branch Saloon. In April of 1879, this saloon became the site of a gunfight that showed just how quickly a simple argument could turn into a life-or-death situation. The two main figures in this story were a man named Frank Loving and a gambler named Levi Richardson. They had been arguing for some time, likely over a woman. The tension between them was thick enough to cut with a knife. On that fateful evening, Richardson walked into the Long Branch Saloon, found Loving playing cards, and started yelling at him. Richardson dared Loving to step outside for a duel, but Loving refused. He wanted no part of it. He tried to calm Richardson down, but the angry gambler would not listen. Richardson pulled out his pistol and fired at Loving, grazing his hand. Loving, who had been sitting down, quickly drew his own weapon and returned fire from his chair. The saloon filled with smoke as the two men emptied their guns at each other across the card table. Richardson was hit multiple times and stumbled out of the saloon, where he collapsed in the street, his story finished. Frank Loving, on the other hand, had survived the close-quarters showdown with only a minor wound. The lawmen of Dodge City, including the famous Bat Masterson, ruled that Loving had acted in self-defense. That saloon showdown was a personal dispute between two men. But sometimes, even lawmen could not escape the violence, especially when they stood by their friends, as Wyatt Earp's closest ally was about to discover. 7. The Frisco Shootout. Not every famous lawman was in a big city like Dodge. Sometimes, the most intense action happened in smaller, out-of-the-way places. This next story takes us to Frisco, Utah, in 1883. It involves a lawman who was a close friend of Wyatt Earp, a man by the name of Elfego Baca, pronounced Elfego Baca. This tale is a true testament to one man's incredible grit and luck. Elfego Baca was a self-proclaimed lawman who was not afraid of anything. He got himself into a world of trouble when he arrested a cowboy for causing a disturbance. The cowboy's friends were not happy about it. In fact, a huge crowd of around 80 angry cowboys gathered, all wanting to free their friend and teach Baca a lesson. Baca found himself cornered in a small adobe hut, a simple house made of mud and straw. What happened next is the stuff of legend. For an incredible 36 hours, Baca held off that entire mob of cowboys all by himself. They fired hundreds, maybe even thousands of shots into that tiny hut. The bullets ripped through the thin walls and tore up everything inside. By some miracle, Baca was not hit. The story goes that the floor of the hut was slightly lower than the ground outside, so the bullets flew right over his head as he lay on the dirt floor. When the fight was finally over and the cowboys gave up, the door to the hut was said to have almost 400 bullet holes in it. Elfego Baca walked out without a scratch, a living legend. Holding off a mob from inside a tiny shack is one kind of fight. But what happens when the fight is not between a lawman and outlaws, but between two groups of lawmen in the middle of a town gone wild? 8. The gunfight at Hyde Park. Welcome to Newton, Kansas, another wild cowtown where tensions often ran high. In August of 1871, the town was the scene of a strange and brutal shootout known as the gunfight at Hyde Park. This was not a clear case of good guys versus bad guys. Instead, it was a messy, confusing affair that involved local lawmen, railroad detectives, and rowdy cowboys. The trouble started with an argument between a local lawman named Billy Bailey and a railroad detective named Mike McCluskey, pronounced McCluskey. The two men had a disagreement during an election, and it ended with McCluskey taking Bailey's life. McCluskey was cleared of any wrongdoing, with the court deciding he acted to protect himself. But that was not the end of the story. Bailey had a lot of friends, cowboys from Texas, who wanted to see McCluskey pay for what he did. A few days later, a very sick McCluskey was resting in a local gambling hall. A big group of cowboys, led by a man named Hugh Anderson, burst in looking for revenge. They cornered the sick man and opened fire, ending his life right there in his bed. A young friend of McCluskey's, a teenager named James Riley, was also in the room. Seeing his friend taken down, Riley, who was suffering from a serious illness himself, grabbed two pistols and unleashed a storm of lead. The room erupted into chaos. When the smoke settled, several men were wounded, and two more were gone. It was a brutal chain reaction of vengeance that left the town of Newton reeling from the violence. A fight between lawmen is a terrible thing, but an even darker story unfolds when the fight is between powerful men and poor farmers who are just trying to protect their homes, leading to a truly sad chapter in the history of the West. 9. The Muscle Slough Tragedy. Not all shootouts in the Wild West were between cowboys and outlaws. Some were the result of heartbreaking disputes over land and livelihood. This is the story of the Muscle Slough Tragedy, pronounced Muscle Slough, which took place in California's San Joaquin Valley in May of 1880. It was a fight that pitted hardworking farmers against a powerful railroad company. Here is what happened. A group of settlers had moved onto land that was owned by the Southern Pacific Railroad. The railroad had promised them they could buy the land for a cheap price once the official land titles were ready. So, the settlers built farms, homes, and irrigation systems, pouring their sweat and life savings into the land. But when the time came to buy, the railroad company went back on its promise. They raised the price so high that the farmers could never afford it. Then, they sold the land out from under them to other buyers. The farmers were heartbroken and angry. They banded together and refused to leave their homes. The railroad company got the law involved to force them out. On May 11th, a U.S. Marshal and a group of railroad men went to one of the farms to evict the family living there. They were met by a large group of angry, armed farmers. No one is sure who fired the first shot, but in a matter of minutes, a terrible gunfight broke out. When it was over, 5 farmers and 2 of the railroad men had lost their lives. It was a devastating event that highlighted the struggle between common people and powerful companies in the Old West. That conflict was over land. But another famous conflict, a whole county-wide war, was about to reach its boiling point in a small settlement, and it would involve the most famous young outlaw of all. 10. The Shootout at Blazer's Mill. Let us journey to New Mexico during the height of the infamous Lincoln County War. This was a bitter and violent conflict between 2 rival factions fighting for control of the county. On one side were the powerful businessmen Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan. On the other was a rancher named John Tunstall. When Tunstall was ambushed and his life was ended, his loyal ranch hands formed a group called the Regulators to seek justice. And their most famous member was a young man named William Bonney, better known as Billy the Kid. On April 4, 1878, the Regulators were eating at a place called Blazer's Mill. It was a sawmill and a trading post. While they were there, they were surprised by the arrival of a tough old buffalo hunter named Buckshot Roberts. Roberts was a known associate of the Dolan faction, and he had a warrant for the arrest of one of the Regulators. The Regulators tried to convince Roberts to surrender, but he was not going down without a fight. He was a one-man army. He barricaded himself inside the main building, and a furious gun battle began. Roberts was an incredible shot. He managed to wound several of the Regulators, including their leader. In the chaos, Billy the Kid got close and fired a shot that struck Roberts, but the old hunter was not done yet. From his protected position, he managed to take out the Regulators' leader, Dick Brewer, before he finally succumbed to his own wound. The Regulators were shaken. They had lost their captain in a fierce fight against a single, determined man. The Lincoln County War was full of ambushes and battles. But for Wyatt Earp, the fight became deeply personal after the OK Corral, leading him on a mission of vengeance that would become a legend in its own right. 11. The Earp Vendetta Ride. The story of the OK Corral did not end when the smoke cleared. In fact, that was just the beginning. The cowboys and their friends were furious about what happened. They wanted revenge on the Earps. A few months after the gunfight, Wyatt Earp's brother Virgil was ambushed in the street at night and badly wounded, losing the use of his left arm. Not long after that, his other brother Morgan was shot in the back while playing pool, and his life was ended right there. Wyatt Earp had had enough. He saw that the law in Tombstone was not going to protect his family, so he decided to take the law into his own hands. He put together a posse of his most loyal friends, including Doc Holliday, and set out on what became known as the Earp Vendetta Ride. A vendetta is a long and bitter quest for revenge. Wyatt was now a U.S. Marshal, so he had a legal right to hunt down the men he believed were responsible. For several weeks in the spring of 1882, Earp and his posse rode through the Arizona desert, hunting their enemies. They tracked down a man named Frank Stillwell at a train station and ended his story on the railroad tracks. A few days later, they found another suspect, a man known as Florentino Cruz, pronounced Flor-antino Cruz, and he met a similar fate. The most dramatic confrontation happened at a place called Iron Springs. Earp's group stumbled upon a camp of cowboys, including the notorious Curly Bill Brocious, pronounced Brocious. A wild gunfight broke out, and Wyatt Earp himself faced down Curly Bill and took him out with a blast from his shotgun. By the end of his ride, Wyatt Earp had eliminated the main threats to his family and cemented his legend as one of the toughest lawmen of the West.